A nation on edge. Israel bracing for Iran and Hezbollah's retaliation for the targeted killings in Tehran and Beirut last week. We will talk to a world-leading expert on Iran, a VP pick and a VP snub opening a wide Jewish debate, and the Olympic Games. Let's talk about them before they're gone. It's Unholy. I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. Unholy, two Jews on the news. Yonit, we thought we were, bracing ourselves for something that might happen immediately after you and I spoke last week, as in hours. And we're still, as you and I record now, sort of middle of the day on Thursday, we're still in that waiting mode. And I'm guessing teeth are on edge. People are on edge where you are.
Yeah, that would be an understatement. I mean, really, it's kind of been recalibrating your brain, Jonathan. It's like you have these two tracks in your head. One is the normal life. It's August, kids are on vacation. It's so hot outside. It's like walking in chicken soup and all that. The other track is sort of the readiness of a nation, because this retaliation is obviously coming. I don't know if it's the next couple of hours or next couple of days. And, this kind of trepidation of what is going to happen in the attack itself, an a possible retaliation by Israel. I could just tell you that this week I was sitting, right after our episode dropped, it was Friday morning, I was sitting in the neighborhood pool with my kids, and obviously everything looks normal. Everyone's having a good time. All the children are walking around with their huge ice cream cones and their ill-fitted bathing suits. And I was sitting there, fully dressed with my laptop, totally blending in and thinking to myself, the one thought in my head is, if a siren goes off now, how do I pluck out 3 kids from 2 different pools, run to the shelter inside the building, make sure no one slips on a pool of their own anxiety? Like, how do you, and that is what is going on throughout the nation these days. People are just, going on with their lives, but this huge sort of black cloud kind of overhead.
Yeah, and people talking about whether their safe rooms have enough, are they sufficiently stocked with water and food and all the rest of it. I mean, and the sort of psychic ordeal, of course, Israelis went through in a big way not that long ago. I mean, what was it? Beginning of April, the same thing of bracing yourselves for the retaliation that you all feel and is coming. I mean, I've been wondering about this delay and how to read it, and whether or not, and there's so much commentary around there, and different analysts and officials who will tell you different things, some saying there is indecision among the Iranians, that in Tehran they're not sure how to react. Even I was reading just today, even whether to react, that's a discussion. Then there's the notion that the delay is deliberately playing on the things we're talking about, which is that it's a kind of psyop. It's a psychological operation designed to freak out Israelis. The point of terror is to terrorize. And the fact that you're sitting there thinking, how do I save my children, in effect, is something that they know has a damage all its own, in a way, as on a level with the actual physical damage that they would aim to inflict. And then lastly is diplomacy playing a part. And, Joe Biden is not standing for re-election, but he is still very much the president and has been, by all accounts, working the phones. And there is a lot of back channel diplomacy. There are ways that an American president can get messages through to an Iranian supreme leader, and by all accounts, he's been doing that. So, even the waiting itself is a source of anxiety, and that may be deliberate, but also something that is an event to be analyzed.
Right. I mean, and the waiting itself, first of all, what has been going on so far is, of course, that international airlines have canceled their flights to Israel. So there are, at one point this week, there were 100,000 Israelis stranded outside of Israel trying to get back. By the way, saying something about the resilience of this country, that they're fighting to get back when it's obvious that this country is going to be under attack in a moment. There are, warnings coming. The United States, Britain, other countries telling their citizens essentially leave Lebanon with any ticket that can take you out of there. Whereas at the same time, Israeli Home Front Command not changing their directives to citizens. So things are building up. And of course, as you say, the United States, building up its force here and sending more of their combat aircraft and warships to the region and saying to Iran again and again, you need to sort of scale this down. I think as we sit here on Thursday, it's 2:30 o'clock Israel time, 7:30 in Washington. I think it's very safe to say there will be some sort of a retaliation, both from Iran and from Hezbollah. What scale will we see is something we're not sure yet. Israeli assumption is pretty sort of focusing, by the way, more on Hezbollah than it is on Iran. We'll talk about that with Dr. Suzanne Maloney. But looking at Hezbollah and trying to see, they will probably target military bases, but also bases in the area of Tel Aviv and the outskirts of Tel Aviv. Why is this important? Because if we keep hearing, and maybe it's true that Tehran doesn't want an all-out war and Hezbollah don't want an all-out war with Israel, but there's a level of randomness here. What happens if one missile just veers off course? What happens if you say, I don't want to hurt civilians, I'm going to hurt military bases, which is severe in itself, but if something changes in even, a slight angle, then you can deteriorate the whole area into an all-out war. That is what can happen. As we talk here, in the meantime, the war in Gaza enters month 11. Wednesday, I remind you, was August 7th. That was 10 months since October 7th, a very sad milestone. And another sad milestone, Israel talking a lot this week about Ariel Bibas turning 5 in captivity. He was kidnapped with his mother, Shiri, and his brother, Kfir. A reminder, maybe, that the people who did this kidnapped mothers and children barefoot from their homes. Yarden Bibas, the father of the family, kidnapped separately, and there are pictures of mobs in Gaza beating him to a pulp, and also this terrible video coming out a few months ago of Hamas telling him that his family is dead, and documenting his reaction. These are real sadists. Israel, by the way, not confirming in any way that the Bibas family is indeed dead, but there are 115 hostages held for 10 months, and at least half of them are alive. And when you think of the Israeli public and their spontaneous, if there were any rare spontaneous exhibitions of joy over these 10 months, was when the hostages came back. It wasn't when Hania was killed. It wasn't when Fouad Shukr was killed in Beirut. It was when the hostages came back. And that is something that is still pending. And definitely, if we are in the downward spiral to a larger war, this might be tragically sidelined.
It might, and in a way, outside the country, I think it has been. There is much less attention and focus on the hostages outside Israel than there is inside. That's obvious, but actually much less focus than I think Israelis would expect, and certainly than they would want, on the prospects for a hostage deal, where we've been round and round this, you and I, in our conversations about it for many, many months. Some reporting some signs that there is a softening in the Israeli position. Who knows that whether the death of Hania has in any way moved or altered the calculation on the Hamas side, whether the military pressure is beginning to tell. And of course, this development that Sinwar is, anointed as the overall leader of Hamas. Hamas is famously an organization that is in sort of different sectors, whether it's Gaza, the West Bank, the prisons, the wider diaspora. Sinwar was always or in recent times has been the master in Gaza, but now he's the overall leader of Gaza. Does that mean, again, some people saying that maybe that means that delayed process before, where what negotiators went through then had to be back, relayed back to Sinwar. Is the process in any way streamlined now that Sinwar is the overall head? Does that make a deal more likely? Some talk that Netanyahu has softened the conditions, some of the demands he had early put in. I come back to my very bleak, pessimistic take on Netanyahu that he doesn't actually want, not with every fibre of his being, a deal for these hostages, because a long attritional war suits him politically, in terms of staying in the job of prime minister, more than an end to the war and the election and the reckoning that would follow. I mean, I would love to be disproved on that, but I think a deal has been there for the taking, and he has not taken it.
We're definitely 2 months after, even a little bit more, the breakthrough. I remind you, Netanyahu essentially putting a framework on the table, Americans agreeing to it, Hamas actually saying for the first time that it does not demand first and foremost a ceasefire and an end of the whole war, and then only to begin to release hostages. That was the breakthrough made. Ever since, long weeks have passed, and still there is no progress made at all in this terrible tragedy of the Israeli hostages. I can't imagine when this all started that we would sit here 10 months after and this would still be an open wound in Israeli society. I think it's important to note that Netanyahu is trying to shift his coalition a little bit so as to to dilute the power of Itamar Ben-Gvir. There have been talks about him trying to replace the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, who, those two have had a very bad relationship even before the war started, and then bring in Gideon Sa'ar, that way bringing in 4 MKs, and thus, as I said, diluting the power of Itamar Ben-Gvir on this government. Does that mean anything in relation to the hostage deal is also a question, but it is very clear that this needs to move forward.
And just to make mention of this, statements from some of the military brass in Israel briefing of the urgency of getting this hostage deal and saying some of these captives just do not have time for any more delay, and stressing some of the young female captives, young women, do not have time. And there have been hints in different quarters, including even from some of the families, that we're talking, and this is gruesome to talk like this, but as you said, it has been 10 months that this has been, that the hints in some quarters that there is the possibility of some issues around pregnancy for some of these women who we know were victims of sexual violence. The military chiefs are saying as boldly as they possibly can, get these women especially out. And it has been a mystery to me how that political pressure has still not completely told on the political leadership, to the extent that they have grabbed hold of this deal when it was, in my view, on the table earlier. But that adds an extra emotional level of urgency. Let me mention a couple of other things that have been making news about this conflict outside Israel, perhaps, inside Israel too, but certainly getting a huge amount of international attention. One of them, it was a comment made at a conference by the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, from one of these two ultra-right figures who until now at least have held, in a way, the government and the prime minister in their hands. Smotrich said, we bring in aid, talking about humanitarian aid, because there is no choice. We can't, he said, in the current global reality manage a war. Nobody will let us cause 2 million civilians to die of hunger, even though it might be justified and moral, until our hostages are returned. So Bezalel Smotrich saying it would be justified and moral to kill through starvation 2 million Gazan civilians, and him using the word civilians. I mean, obviously, that has gone around the world. I just mention again that the International Court of Justice are deliberating over genocide charges. And one of the big things in that argument has been, what have political leaders in Israel been saying? Have they been using genocidal talk? There's been an effort to say, well, nobody who's got control of the war. The finance minister is quite a senior job. It's not just a random commentator on TV. It's the finance minister saying, in effect, left to our own devices, if the world would let us, we would like to kill 2 million civilians through starvation. It is an appalling thing to have said, but it is one that will have real consequences. And I say it's already having some in terms of attention.
Yeah, I mean, we should say, first of all, that Bezalel Smotrich is the far right of the far right in the Israeli political spectrum, right? I mean, in Israel, there's this saying, miyamin rakir, there's only a wall to his right. And you see that also in the polls. He's not getting anything past the electoral threshold. His former partner, right, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is a different story. This is not to say that the fact that Netanyahu took this very extreme individual and made him not only finance minister, I remind you, but also a minister in the Ministry of Defense. That's on him. And of course, when you see that headline all over the world, you're not supposed to say, oh, he's a very extreme person, he doesn't represent most Israelis. This is a very damaging thing. I would still say most Israelis think this is abhorrent, what he said. There's no way that this could ever happen. But why say it not only on the moral level of it, but are you actually giving the ICJ? Like, here, please take the evidence. I mean, that is just, you have to say that about what Bezalel Smotrich said this week.
You do, and I agree. And just on that point about the ICJ, Turkey this week, a NATO member, petitioning to join South Africa in that case. And just talking about cases and picking up something we talked about last week, the High Court in Israel heard a petition this week to close down the detention facility at Sde Teiman. That we talked about that last week because of that big, riot as right-wing activists sought to, invade the detention center military base to protect a group of soldiers there accused of abuse of one of those Palestinian detainees. Last week I made the point that this is sadly not a few bad apples, and with apt timing, the human rights group B'Tselem this week reported or issued a report revealing dozens of testimonies from Palestinians who'd been detained by Israel since the Gaza war began, speaking of abuse, starvation, sleep deprivation, denial of medical treatment. And before we think, okay, well, those are obviously terrorists, most of those detainees were then released without prosecution, and B'Tselem speaking of systematic and institutional policy of abuse and torture of Palestinians. The point I was going to make about the phrase "a few bad apples" is often people quote that, forgetting the rest of the aphorism. The rest of the saying is "a few bad apples spoils the whole barrel." In other words, if you have a few who are behaving in this way, in the end, the system itself does become contaminated. And so as a coda to our conversation last week, that this unfortunately is not just a one-off. There is a widespread pattern here, and the detail of that came this week via human rights group B'Tselem.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to say that Israeli society is deeply scarred by what happened on October 7th and the atrocities that Israelis saw, and that the Hamas terror organization and this massacre. And I think that when you add to that the sort of black holes of places that aren't guarded properly, and as we said, the extreme politicians that are sitting in government, all that adds together to something that is very, concerning. I would just say that, in the same way that Abu Ghraib is not the United States and the American society, Sde Teiman is not Israeli society. But I definitely agree that it is something that must be dealt with. I think we should move on to let's talk a little bit about American politics. Take the load off. What do you think?
Yes, I mean, it's almost become a sort of respite, isn't it? We're sort of just to absorb what's going on.
I don't want to say the comic relief, but definitely let's talk about somebody else's stuff.
Almost. I mean, because it has been a bit of a soap opera there about who Kamala Harris would pick as her running mate. And this was of great interest to us and our audience because there was a very specific dimension to it. So as everyone knows, I think, it came down more or less at the end to a straight fight between Tim Walz, governor of Minnesota, who in the end Kamala Harris did pick, and Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. And there were all kinds of, you could draw up little columns with pros and cons of both of those. But germane for us was the fact that a big issue for Josh Shapiro, raised by the progressive wing, particularly of the party, against him, was his position, so it was said, on Israel, as if he was the pro-Israel guy in the contest. Now, the point I think we made last week was that actually that was an odd formulation because actually, if you look at what he'd said, Josh Shapiro had been no more, as it were, pro-Israel than either Tim Walz or, for example, Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona or any of the other names in the frame. In fact, if anything, he'd been more critical of Netanyahu, who he called a terrible leader, than some of the others. And therefore, the question began to be asked, what was it about Jewish Governor Josh Shapiro that made so many, wary of having him and putting this terrible word genocide around his neck? Was it because he was Jewish, in effect? And that was in the air. And so it became a kind of test whether if she did not choose him, would she be sort of bowing, Kamala Harris, buckling to that anti-Israel wing and to what was in a way a very unfair take on Josh Shapiro and his position. It got further complicated, I think, by the emergence of an article that Shapiro had written when he was 20 years old, I underline, for a student paper that first of all said he had doubts about the two-state solution, but also talked about himself. He identified himself as somebody who had volunteered for the IDF. The details of that were not clear whether he had or hadn't, but that was in that student paper. Anyway, all of that was in the mix. And so if she had chosen him, I think a lot of American Jews would have been very, very delighted. But they're, people who are in the who've made the Gaza issue very, very central in the Democratic Party would have been and had voiced tremendous unease about that appointment. In the end, Tim Walz of Minnesota got the nod.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, and we can call it, I think, let's call a spade, the double standard, right? Suddenly he's under scrutiny in a way that neither Walz or Kelly were under. I mean, when you think of the fact that, Walz, after the attacks on October 7th, he ordered the flags in Minnesota to be flown half-mast. He said, if you don't find moral clarity on Saturday morning, you find yourself waiting to think about what you needed to say, then you need to reevaluate, et cetera. These people, they're not very different in shades, but suddenly it's the Jewish governor and only him who's being called Genocide Josh, right? So that says something to you about what he went through. I would just say that the other thing that's a little bit sad about this, and even before we get to the Israel-Gaza issue, is somewhere in some room, I assume someone was saying to themselves, if we have a woman who's Black and Asian at the top of the ticket, maybe it's a problem to have another minority as VP. And that's just sad because in the sense that you would imagine that he's a very good candidate. And it does, and I'm zooming out from the Jewish thing here, it does seem like the campaign is listening a lot and focusing a lot on the social media, the left flank of the party, all the sort of younger generation of Democrats. The problem with that is that you're so enthusiastic about the sort of newly found coolness factor that fell on Kamala Harris's head, a little bit like a coconut, that famous sort of meme that's running around of something that she herself said. The problem with that is twofold. One is that the voters in Michigan, Wisconsin, and other places, Pennsylvania, they care about the economy. They don't necessarily care if Kamala is brat or not. And the other thing is that once you say someone is very, very cool, the next day you can move on to someone else who is cool or say that person isn't cool. We've all been through high school. We know how this works. I would just say I think they look too much at those crowds, and that is connected maybe to the decision not to take on Josh Shapiro as VP.
I think this is so interesting. I think this whole business about Josh Shapiro touches on a conversation we had with David Baddiel on here a long time ago, where he talked about the ambivalence about the whiteness of Jews, which is that they were sort of too white for the hard left, who would not consider them a minority, who were deserving of protection, but not white enough for the right, who might consider them too ethnic. So why do I say all that? I think you're right that if the decision was made because it would, the left were unhappy with Josh Shapiro, I can see why people would be very, very dismayed by that. What was put to me instead was something interesting, closer to what you were saying about too much diversity on the ticket. So an analyst said to me this week that you've got a Black South Asian woman there on the ticket. You can have too much diversity. And the trouble is Josh Shapiro reads as urban, said to me. Mm-hmm. Now, the person who said this immediately said, look, I'm Jewish myself, so, this is not anti-Semitic. But you look at him, he seems a kind of urban guy. And I thought to myself, you know what? I know what she means. There's something about the fact that he's Josh Shapiro doesn't look like a sort of, the classic Midwesterner that Tim Walz conveys. And that's even me thinking that. And that's because she was looking for a white guy to appeal to conservative Midwest, often rural America. And in a way, Josh Shapiro doesn't have that vibe, and vibe matters in politics. He does look, in a way like she looks, like sort of a coastal urban type. And him being Jewish is part of that. Now, I can be more forgiving of that calculation because it's a bit to me like the calculation that also said we couldn't have Pete Buttigieg on the ticket, even though he's from the Midwest, he's from Indiana, because he's a gay man. And so having a Black woman, gay man, it's too much diversity. Tim Walz is kind of Lake Wobegon, Minnesota, the high school football coach, ordinary American dad. I get that. If that's the reason, then fine. The other thing that was said was chemistry, that Tim Wall, they all had these interviews, with her, like a final round of interviews in The Apprentice. They all met her, and Josh Shapiro apparently told his own staff, that didn't go perfectly. There wasn't a natural click, and she felt it more with Tim Walz. Again, I think that's legitimate, but you stand take 10 paces back, and you think, here was a choice of a really popular governor in a state you've got to win, and yet she didn't choose him. Then that, it was the unexpected decision, and for all the different reasons we've been saying, the Jewish thing played a part.
Yeah. And I would add two things. One is that in opinions, Josh Shapiro is much more moderate than Tim Walz is. Whatever his vibe is, that is interesting. And I think there's a large group. We spoke to Alyssa Farah Griffin on the show. She used to be Trump's comms director, and now she's an anti-Trumper. And there's a large group of those Republicans who are not going to vote Trump. You could bring in that group with a Josh Shapiro. I'm not sure you could bring in that group with Tim Walz. So what you're saying is essentially, I want to galvanize my base. I want my base to come out and vote. I'm not trying to get votes from the other side. The other point I would make, and you talked about diversifying the ticket, and I smiled to myself because I was thinking of a campaign that we both covered. I was covering it vigorously for the school newspaper at the time, the Bill Clinton, Al Gore. Right? Bill Clinton picking Al Gore as his running mate, essentially picking another Bill Clinton. This is a young governor from a red state, The only difference between the two, let's put the women's issues aside here. The only difference between the two was that Al Gore could never upstage Bill Clinton in the charisma department. And I think that goes to something, this has nothing to do with the Jewishness of Josh Shapiro. I think he could upstage her in the charisma department. He is he's a remarkable speaker. He can captivate an audience. And maybe, and this is just in the realm of human psychology, maybe something about that prevented her from taking him on the ticket.
Yeah, I'm prepared to think that may be a very damning but perceptive insight into
that almost prevented me from taking you on as co-host. But I said, no, Yonit, you be magnanimous. You take him on.
And you thought there's no risk of that at all. He's a Tim Walz dad figure. He's not going to be a problem. No, I think there's something in that. The other piece of this I was going to say that, again, I think is sort of legitimate is it's just a political point. You're right. They haven't gone for ideological balance. And that's true. Mm-hmm. And that could be, she may pay a very heavy price for that. That's normally what you would try and do with these tickets, is to make sure there's a sort of left, right, broadly balance. He is a guy whose own background is rural, and I think Democrats have done very badly in rural America. True. And the point that is made, it's very nerdy now, but I know I'm among fellow nerds here, we can talk like this. But, Democrats were losing a lot in rural areas, sometimes 75 to 25. They only have to lose by 70 to 30 in some of those states to make all the difference. Does a Tim Walz get to some of those rural counties in some of those states like Michigan or Wisconsin in a way that a Josh Shapiro couldn't, for all the cultural reasons we've been saying? Maybe. And so I'm more and more in politics, I'm finding that the ideological record is one thing, but the vibe is another. Here in the UK, there was a choice the Conservatives had between Liz Truss, who had voted Remain in the Brexit referendum, but looked like a Brexit person, and Rishi Sunak, who looked like a tech bro, even though he'd voted Leave. His vibe was Remain, her vibe was Leave, even though their record was the opposite. Sometimes that happens in politics. Tim Walz's vibe may be more moderate than Josh Shapiro's vibe, even though the policy record is the exact other way around.
So back from the refreshing discussion about American politics to the murky waters of the Middle East, because this really is a week in which everyone here is looking, not only in Israel, by the way, but also in Lebanon and the rest of the region, looking at what would be the response from Iran and from Hezbollah, and then what Israel might do. So we thought that the right person to talk to would be someone who is an expert on Iran, to try and tell us where this is heading, not only in the next couple of days and weeks, but really sort of a long-term conversation.
Suzanne Maloney is one of America's foremost authorities on Iran. She's the director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, focusing on Iran and also energy in the Persian Gulf. And in the past, she's advised both Democratic and Republican administrations on Iran policy, having served as a member of Condoleezza Rice's policy planning staff at the State Department. She's authored or edited 3 books on Iran and indeed studied in Tehran as part of what I understand is the first academic exchanges between the United States and Iran since the revolution. Suzanne Maloney, welcome to Unholy.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
As we speak, and Yonit and I have already been talking about this, there is this kind of waiting going on in Israel for the Iranian response to, in particular, the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh. And people are beginning to wonder why the wait, and coming up with all kinds of explanations for why this response has been, as it were, delayed, and whether that's because Iran's thinking twice about doing it, whether it's a kind of, almost a psyop to make Israelis be on edge, or whether it is indeed that the United States has succeeded in sort of putting a restraining hand on whatever Iran were planning. What's your take on why, as we speak, and of course everything could change in the coming hours, but at this moment, there has not yet been that response?
I think I'm actually less surprised than many others. If you look back to the series of events that ended on April 13th and 14th with the unprecedented Iranian missile and drone strikes on Israel, that actually had been an interval of about 12 to 13 days since the ostensible precipitating event, the strike on the ostensible consulate and the killing of an Iranian general in Damascus, that Iran then vowed to respond to. And I think at that point in time, there was a recognition that Iran wasn't necessarily prepared for such a unprecedented act, and so it may have taken more time than it might for a second reprisal strike for Iran to assemble. In general, if we look back to the response to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in January 2020, these things are never sort of automatic or immediate, and Iran typically does bide its time. And so I would not assume that we are out of the woods. I think that the Iranian response was always going to come after the meeting that it in fact had called of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, which took place on the 7th of August. And that, in fact, I think was a necessary condition for Iran to have rallied the rest of the Islamic world and to have, in fact, demonstrated at least some degree of coordination and solidarity with the Gulf states, which have always been adversaries of Iran, but have embarked on this kind of, modest rapprochement over the course of the past year and a half. So I would say, it's possible that diplomacy has worked. It's possible that there is some degree of restraint in Tehran and concern about the possibility of an escalatory spiral. But I think that, we really can't breathe easily until quite some time has passed. And the likelihood is that the Iranians will find some opportunity to retaliate, and it may not be the way that we're expecting.
So first of all, I can say, as being the Israeli on the conversation, no one in this country is breathing easy at this point. And I'm interested in what you said about, a surprise that we're not expecting. Because right now, the assumption of the security echelon in Israel is that actually the Iranian response might be scaled down a little, that we will see something that reminds us of that night of April 13th. And actually, Hezbollah is kind of the wild card that really want to retaliate for the assassination of Fouad Shukr, who's the essentially number 2 in command under Nasrallah, and that will actually be the sort of tougher response. So I'm interested in what you think could be a surprise, and do you also see that kind of relationship between Iran and its proxy Hezbollah? How does this play out in this, what we probably will see in the next hours or days, the retaliation against Israel?
Well, I think you're exactly right that there's not just one, but there are 2 precipitating events in this case. And of course, Iran and Hezbollah are in full solidarity with one another, and they coordinate very closely. But they're also careful to preserve the deterrent effect of Hezbollah's tremendous arsenal of missiles. And it's not entirely clear exactly who's going to get precedence in this case, and to what extent there might be an Iranian preference for the Lebanese to go out first and effectively enable the Iranians to avoid putting themselves on the line. I mean, as we know, for the past 45 years, the Iranians have been very prepared to engage in violent activity against Israel and against Israelis all around the world, but they've often done it, almost always done it, in a way that is not directly attributable or in ways that have relied upon their proxies. Hezbollah is the most important of those proxies. Hezbollah's loss over the course of the past week has potentially been greater than that of Iran. Haniyeh was an important political ally, but in effect, it was really the humiliation of his assassination on Iranian territory on the day of the inauguration of the Iranian president that I think has resulted in the expectation that the Iranians would respond. Whereas in the case of Hezbollah, this has been, apparently some violation of what the Lebanese considered to be some degree of restraint in ground rules with Israel about exactly where and who would be struck. And there may be a greater degree of urgency on the part of Hezbollah to avenge its own than there is from the Iranian perspective in trying to reestablish whatever deterrence they might have felt with respect to Israel.
I mean, that goes to an interesting question, which is the extent to which the Hezbollah operate with independence, what agency they have separate from Tehran, or whether they are, just a sort of an arm of the decision making that goes on in Iran. To what extent they can make their own decisions. I'd love to hear what you say on that. But I'm also conscious that you're in Taiwan as we speak to you now. You're traveling, but ordinarily you sit in Washington, and you mentioned the sort of the role of diplomacy and what role that has played. A crucial thing right at the start of this, very soon after October the 7th, was Joe Biden's trip to Israel and that one-word message to Iran and its and included in that Hezbollah, which is, if you're thinking of joining in, don't. And I'm interested to hear from you on how much ice the American don't still cuts with Iran in this moment.
Well, I think that was an important moment and a powerful moment for the American president to stand in Israel and really issue a very direct and succinct warning to America's adversaries and Israel's adversaries not to compound the tragedy and the horror of October 7th. But of course, we know from the start Hezbollah was firing on Israel as of October 8th, that Iran and its proxies were ramping up attacks over the course of October, November, December, and well into this year. And in fact, this has not been a situation in which they have abided by that don't in any full and wholesale way. There was never a likelihood that Iran was going to join the fight with Hamas and put its own troops on the line. That's, simply unprecedented with respect to Iran's pressure on Israel over these many years. And the U.S. has struggled, frankly, to effectively deter some of these proxy groups that the Iranians have mobilized, whether it's the Houthis or the Shia militias in Iraq that have been much more active than they had been over the course of mid to late 2023, when there appeared to be a quiet understanding between the United States and Iran, one that resulted in the release of several Americans who had been held unjustly for many years in Iran in September of 2023, just before the October 7th attacks. And so I think that, the don't was important, but it was not, in fact, something that really precluded the expansion of the war. We have been in a position where the war has been in creeping expansion mode for many months. And April appeared to be a kind of a seminal moment, one in which the war might have gone in a much more significant way in terms of its escalation. That was averted in part because of the diplomacy, I think, at that point between the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government. What we now know to be an angry phone call from Joe Biden, effectively insisting that there would not be a commensurate response from Israel to the April 13th missile and drone strike by Tehran. ended that cycle of escalation. But I think, that crossed a Rubicon. The Iranians have never done what they did on April 13th. They've never attacked Israel in a direct and accountable fashion. And with the overwhelming number of projectiles that they used at that time, there was really no guarantee that there wasn't going to be damage. The Iranians were prepared to risk a direct war with Israel at that time, and I think they still are prepared for that kind of an eventuality. And that puts us in a very different situation than I think we've ever found ourselves in before.
The fact that you're saying that, I keep hearing, I have to share with you that in the television studio when I anchor the news, I keep hearing the experts saying Iran doesn't want a full-out war with Israel. And to me, I keep remembering the echo of a year ago when experts were saying Hamas doesn't want a full-out war with Israel. Well, we discovered something else on October 7th. So I guess the question is, what does Iran want? I think it was Qasem Soleimani who had the modus operandi of a ring of fire around Israel, right? There's going to be the Hezbollah in the north, Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and we're going to sort of, strangle Israel from all directions. Is that what they want? Or do they indeed want something that is more a full-out war directly between the two countries? What is the plan, the Iranian plan here?
I think the Iranian strategy has long been the ring of fire approach, and it remains that in many respects. But I think what they've seen over the course of the events since October 7th, in many ways, predicted and anticipated and goaded by the Iranian leadership, including on October 3rd, when the Iranian supreme leader made a speech in which he predicted that Israel would die of anger and die of hate, is that Israel has been wounded. Borders have been shrunk by the pressure and the violence from both the north and the south, that it has been delegitimized around the world with the protests against Israel happening on a regular basis in the United States and in Europe, with diplomatic and international organizations condemning Israel. And I think they sense opportunity. There's always been language in Iran that, the sort of very famous language for which a former president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, was roundly criticized, has been long part of the Iranian lexicon. It effectively translated as Israel will pass from the page of time or the page of history, which has always been taken as a sort of passive approach to this. And I think in many respects, what the Iranians are doing is ramping up a much more active opportunistic effort to try to apply pressure to Israel, to create a sense of no future horizon for Israelis. And, part of that is a greater willingness to engage in direct violence with Israel in a way that I believe is extremely dangerous.
This conversation is not making me feel better. So as you're saying, is it just in the sense of the fact that they're seeing this opportunity? What do we need to do? What do Israelis need to do? What does the coalition need to be doing if this is indeed what they are sensing at this time?
Well, I mean, I hate to echo the Biden administration, but I do think it all begins with a ceasefire. I think that as long as the war is raging, as long as there is no avenue toward a better future for both peoples, the Iranians are just enjoying the advantage that they gain from this violence. They always, the regime, I should say, not the people, but the regime in Iran always benefits from chaos and upheaval. It always finds allies and partners and opportunities to increase the pressure in those kinds of situations. We've learned this from our own experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think that what I worry greatly about is not just the sort of tactics that Iran is using today, but the role that it will be positioned to play in whatever day after might come. And a Palestinian people who have endured tremendous violence over the course of the past 10 months, who have to rebuild under very difficult conditions in which there may be very little funding, very little security, very little good governance. Iranians tend to swoop in those situations. We know they did in the aftermath of the 2006 war in Lebanon, and effectively snatch victory from the jaws of defeat and rebuild Hezbollah to be stronger and much more dangerous than it had ever been before. So I think, what we need today is a ceasefire to bring the hostages home, to ensure that there is some kind of a plan for governance and security and reconstruction in Gaza, and to think what a future for both peoples is going to look like.
I mean, in a way, Yonit's initial question related to how, taking us into the minds of the Iranians long term, I'm interested just on the immediate term, and the attack that you've been referring to a couple of times or the operation in April, was often described as a calibrated response by the Iranians. And I'm interested to know about what the calculations are going on right now, how they calibrate what they do next in the following ways. One, take us into their minds. Will they be thinking they have to respond harder than they did in April simply because this is the second time that Israel has had as they would say, sort of a jab at their territory? Second, what difference does it make that the target was not Iranian, but a guest in their country? Does that make it almost the demand from their point of view, as they see it, a more severe response? And then third, because this just leapt out at me, this detail in some of the reporting, that the fact that Haniya it seems, was taken out not by a missile that might have had to travel through airspace, but instead through a device left in the room in the guest house where he was staying, that itself means that in a way, that's less of a humiliation in some way. I don't know. You tell me how those three things and other things will factor in the minds of the Iranian planners as they calibrate or decide their response.
I think those are really excellent questions. And, honestly, we're all sort of surmising what we can about Iranian intent and calculations. I mean, one of the factors that you mentioned is that this is the second time. In fact, it's not the second time. Israel has conducted a number of assassinations on Iranian territory, as well as a number of other covert operations, including secreting the entire archives of the Iranian nuclear program out from under their own grasp. I mean, it's really extraordinary,
Absolutely.
The ability of operational dexterity that the Israeli government has within Iran. And yet, historically, the Iranians have sought to effectively try to pin these assassinations on other groups or figures in order to try to avoid culpability for their own tremendous intelligence failures. And so I think that, what is interesting to me is that in the context of this war, the Iranians did choose to respond in a way that was unprecedented on April 13th. They have lost many other important figures in Syria, in particular, over the course of many years, in which this kind of gray zone warfare between Iran and Israel is quite well established. And yet they used the fig leaf of the fact that it had been ostensibly on diplomatic territory. Of course, we know that Iran's respect for the sovereignty of diplomatic facilities is not terribly strong over the years. They have attacked many embassies. They, of course, famously held 52 American diplomats and other personnel hostage for 444 days back in 1979 and 1980. And so, the decision to, sort of go up the escalatory chain at that point in time, I think reflected a very different calculus than what we have seen over the course of many years. And whether or not that, is now the bar from which that they will always operate, I think that it's important to recognize that Iran does not always behave consistently, that there have been times in which they have overreacted and times in which they have, by our own estimation, underreacted. I'm not sure it matters that it was a guest rather than an Iranian. I think in many ways, given Iranian culture, the culture of mehmuni, of hosting and just hospitality is deeply ingrained. It may sound a little bit absurd given the kind of approach of this regime, but it is very much part of the Iranian character that guests are sacrosanct. And so that in many ways, and just the extent to which this happened only hours after Haniya had met with Khamenei, the Iranian supreme leader, does serve, I think, as a very direct humiliation. And so in that respect, I do expect, some kind of a tangible response. I think what's interesting about that is that the Iranian press is pushing back on that narrative fairly specifically, and it's unclear to what extent the allegation that it was a device planted several months before has been substantiated, other than in reporting by people with very good sources from the New York Times. The Iranian allegation is, in fact, that it was some kind of a shoulder-fired missile, which still, suggests a breach of operational security. And, they knew exactly which room to fire into, and someone was on the ground. So I'm not sure it's actually exculpatory from the Iranian side, but yet they continue to insist on that narrative. And I think it's a kind of interesting point here in the dueling narratives that we're seeing. Either way, it certainly does suggest a high degree of specificity in Israel's intelligence and its ability to pinpoint, I think, just two individuals. At least from the reporting, it does not appear as though there were, large-scale injuries or large-scale destruction, and that is quite sophisticated.
Yeah, it does make you sadly wonder where all that was on the morning of Saturday, October 7th, but we'll leave that aside for now. I do wonder because obviously the main goal is to obtain nuclear weapons. I mean, that is what they are trying to do. That is what the regime wants. I assume more than anything for its own survival, but that is what this regime wants. Aren't they worried that an all-out war, this kind of something like what we saw in April, would endanger that in any way? That they're not concerned at all?
I think this has historically always been the restraining factor for the Iranians, not just the nuclear program, but really the regime itself. They recognize that if and when it comes to a direct war with Israel, the United States will be at Israel's side, and there's really no other outcome in which the Iranian regime survives, and there isn't massive destruction within Iran itself. And so they have always been relatively prudent in the sense that they have relied on these proxies and they have sought to distance their own people from the direct, at least physical implications of their attacks. It certainly has had economic implications for Iranians. And I think that still exists, this sort of calculus about how do we avoid something that gets too far out of control. They even did that on April 13th. Of course, there was heavy signaling. It was, well known to the United States that there would be an attack that would involve missiles as well as drones. I think there was some surprise about the extent of the use of both ballistic and cruise missiles in the orchestration of the simultaneous attack using drones, which was intended, I think, to overwhelm Israel's air defense. There are many who would look at the outcome on April 13th and say it was a humiliation for Iran. They really did no damage. And in fact, many of the missiles didn't quite even leave their launchers. Mm-hmm. I think the Iranian leadership probably sees it very differently, that they broke a taboo, that they attacked Israel directly, and in effect got a little bit of a slap on the wrist in response. And this is what worries me, is that they're going to be tempted to try it again, and that, even if they don't try it this time, that, the taboo has been broken, and the Islamic Republic has lived to tell the tale, and they're not effectively deterred.
I mean, the big takeaway in some ways from April, well, there were many, but one of them was this united response to blunt or thwart the Iranian attack. Prime Minister Netanyahu called it the Abraham alliance, but, with Israel getting military help from the US, the UK, but also Jordan, UAE and others. What about on the other side, the coalition or alliance that Iran is part of? And I'm thinking here particularly of its relationship with Moscow, but also Beijing. I mean, to what extent is Iran acting as an independent power in the region, but instead as part of a global alliance arrayed against the West? How should we read that?
I think it's not a coincidence that the Russian defense chief, Shoigu, was in Tehran this week. I think, if anything, the Russians are trying to ensure that there is at least a show of moral support with the Iranians. And but I'm not sure how much that actually matters when push comes to shove. I don't think anyone, certainly not anyone in Tehran, expects the Russians or the Chinese or the North Koreans to come to their defense. This is an alliance of convenience. It's one that has been, I think, very valuable to Russia, very valuable to China. I'm not sure it actually does very much good for the Iranians, other than it provides an outlet for oil that they would not be able to export and for revenues that they would not be able to access outside of these relationships. But in terms of strategic depth, in terms of long-lasting or immediate contributions to Iranian security, it's largely symbolic rather than operational. Over time, if we in fact see the transfer of fighter aircraft and other kinds of really valuable defense cooperation, then I will take it a little bit more seriously. But I think for now, it's primarily symbolic.
And whatever, I mean, we are heading towards an American election. Whatever the outcome of that is, I'm reading between the lines that you think that the United States relationship to Iran should be a tougher one, trying to deter this power that is growing in audacity?
I think it has to be a tougher one. I think what we've seen is that left to its own devices, Iran doesn't just cause trouble and tragedy and pain and horror for the region. It really does expand its reach, and Iran played a critical role with the provision of drones and now drone technology to the Russians at a really important moment in the war in Ukraine. And this is, just not a problem that affects the Middle East. It also is one that we are going to have to contend with. You see the massive array of American armor that's been pulled into the region over the course of the past few days in preparation for some kind of anticipated retaliation. That is not the way that the sort of strategic interests of the United States are best served. We'd like to be focused on the longer term challenges in the Asia Pacific region, and yet because we have this rogue state in the Middle East that continues to threaten its neighbors and cause disarray and instability around the region, we're forced to stay deeply engaged in this part of the world. And so I think what we have to do is rebuild a serious diplomatic strategy for isolating Iran, for applying pressure to Tehran. It's not going to be as easy as it was, and it was awfully hard back then during the Obama administration. We won't be able to count on the support of the P5. Russia will be an adversary to this approach rather than an ally. But I think that we've shown that we can be creative diplomatically, that we can, in fact, pull together alliances of common values and common interests to have meaningful effect on particularly states as dangerous as Iran is.
Dr. Suzanne Maloney, thank you so much for that, sobering but thorough assessment of what's going on. We're very grateful.
We really are. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great to talk with you both.
So you call that conversation sobering. I think that's very accurate. And what she said about, first of all, this being a creeping, the war being in a creeping expansion mode, which is really true. And also, to look at very clearly, if something we've learned tragically after October 7th, listen when your enemies are talking. And she said it very clearly, right? That in some ways, Iran has crossed this Rubicon. It has decided that it's much less afraid of a war, or much less concerned about a war, an all-out war directly with Israel. And I think since she is really one of the smartest people on this topic, it is important to listen to what she has to say in her analysis on what's going on and what the United States should do and Israel should do.
Yeah, no, I thought it was sobering, but also extremely clarifying. And very interesting to hear someone like her, who has worked for both administrations, saying, yeah, the position has to be tough on Iran. Almost between the lines, whoever wins in November, they are going to have to maintain a strong line on Iran. And she knows what she's talking about.
Now, look, I've been the Israeli talking about how tense it is here in Israel. It hasn't exactly been very quiet where you are either.
No, there have been some really ugly scenes here in the UK over the last week or so. Riots in multiple cities with the far right, fascistic right, racist right, rioting, looting, and particularly targeting those they think often, mistakenly are either immigrants or are Muslims. As we speak, last night there were huge demonstrations to counter them, some very wonderful scenes in Brighton and London, other cities where people turning out in huge numbers to say, this is who we are, rather than the voices from the far right. Where it started, as so often, and I was thinking this when we were talking about the attack that started the round of hostilities with Hezbollah and the attack that killed 12 children in the Golan Heights, 12 Druze children. In this case, again, it is the death of children that starts this thing. This was a hideous, horrific incident in the northern town of Southport at the end of last month. 3 girls, one age 6, one age 7, one age 9, were killed in a multiple stabbing event. They were at a Taylor Swift dance class, like a summer class for kids, girls to dance to Taylor Swift. A young man, 17 years old, ran in with a knife and stabbed lots of those children, and 3 of them were killed. Now, very quickly, rumours went round saying the assailant had been a Muslim asylum seeker who had arrived illegally in the UK by boat. Those claims were false, but they proliferated online in a very quick way. And before you know it, there were these refuges where asylum seekers are housed, which suddenly had crowds, mobs outside them, organized online by the far right, including setting fire to some of these hostels where terrified refugees were holed up inside. Video going around of people setting those buildings on fire, gesturing, drawing their finger across their throat as if to threaten killing to those refugees inside. Ugly, ugly scenes. 2 points about this. First is the role of social media has been central. It has been spread around, particularly on what used to be Twitter and is now X. Elon Musk himself getting involved and stirring it up, retweeting, quote tweeting some of the most trenchant and lurid voices on the right, and even at one point doing a tweet that said civil war is inevitable, as if ramping up what was already a very difficult situation, and even getting into direct confrontational exchanges online, one-sided, with the Prime Minister of the UK, the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, only been in office for a month. So that's been going on. But the other, local angle, parochial angle for listeners to this podcast is that you had voices on the far right who were putting out tweets saying, let's not forget Jews are immigrants too, and horrible pictures, as if suggesting, let's not just attack Muslims, we should be attacking Jews. And meanwhile, on the far left, who are opposing them, voices saying the people organising these far-right demonstrations are, of course, you've guessed it, Zionists. It's the hand of the Zionists organising these protests, just like organising everything else, in order to cause disorder and distress inside Britain. This coming, while new figures show that anti-Semitic attacks over the last 6 months, anti-Semitic incidents had more than doubled in the last 6 months. So wherever, anything like this goes on, there's going to be somebody to point the finger at us.
Yes, that's true. And the other thing, and you mentioned that the report by the Community Security Trust saying that their anti-Semitic incidents have doubled, and also I think are at their highest point between January and June. And as the United Kingdom sort of prides itself now of these anti-racist demonstrations all over the country in support of minorities and of immigrants, you need to remember those are also the facts, right? That Jews have been under this kind of attack in Britain for a long time.
Yes, but worth saying, because it's reassuring for Jewish listeners to this, not on the level that we saw this week. There haven't been those scenes of huge crowds surrounding Jewish buildings and setting them on fire, which is what we did see. A last historical echo, the notion of a particular small minority being accused of the death of children falsely and then being the target of mob violence, that has a millennium-old history in these islands. And I'm thinking of the blood libel, which was an English invention, England's gift to anti-Semites around the world. It was in the city of Norwich in the 12th century, and then later in Lincoln and other places where Jews were accused of killing children for sort of, quasi-religious purposes. That was the false accusation. And then Jews were turned on with lethal consequences. So far, thank God, as we speak, there hasn't been a death. I think it's only by luck that no asylum seeker or refugee lost their lives in those scenes outside those hostels. But there is a historical echo there. And quite a few Jews have felt it and noted it this week.
Yes, and much easier to do in the age of social media, as you said. We need to dole out some awards, I would say. Don't you think?
We do. And I thought a chutzpah
I'm vigorously
award,
holding on to the Mensch Award this week, so you do
You
whatever
hold
you
on. You hold on. And as we were both saying, that following American politics has become a kind of, for people who otherwise have to look at the Middle East, it's become a kind of escapist guilty pleasure. None more so than the frankly bizarre story this week of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I mean, he has been serving up quite a lot of the bizarre throughout his quixotic, independent bid for the presidency. This time he put out a social video appearing to show him telling the story, talking to comedian Roseanne Barr, who herself has a sort of, complex history, talking to her about a story which is, you have to read it to believe it. He says that he was driving along many years ago, saw the body of a dead bear cub that had been knocked over by, he stresses, another driver. He thought, wouldn't it be fun to put the bear cub in the back of his car, take it to Central Park, and then, together with a bicycle that he just happened to have in the back of his vehicle, leave it there to suggest that somehow the bear cub had been knocked down in Central Park. Spool back to when the incident actually happened. There was a sort of mystery. There was intrigue about the dead bear cub found in Central Park. It was a mystery that was never solved. Here comes RFK Jr. to say, well, I can explain it was me bringing this carcass of a dead bear cub, which, by the way, he said he did plan to skin and eat. This is his attempt to, information management. He thinks this plays well for him compared to, I think, probably what he feared was some other version was going to come out. It is bizarre on every level. We talked before, didn't we, when American governor from, I think, North Dakota, Kristi Noem, talked about killing a puppy. That did great damage to her presidential
pretty much
hopes.
Killed that campaign and pretty much killed this campaign too, no?
I think this could do. I don't think people want somebody who kills bear cubs or doesn't kill them but pretends to or brings the body to the Central Park. It's a new category for us potentially, which is the Mashugana of the week category.
I think so.
Maybe that's the one.
I think we should actually have that new category. Okay. It's very hard act to follow there. But I will try with the Mensch Award of the week. Look, we've not really talked about the Olympic Games here. I think it's a good opportunity to give the Mensch Award to the Israeli team at the Olympic Games in Paris, not only because this has been a really difficult year for Israel and because they themselves have received threats. This has been the best year for Israel in the Olympics, 6 medals to this point, and it's still going on, so we can hope for a few more. Specifically, just to say something about Artyom Dolgopiat, who's Israel's first Israeli in history to win back-to-back medals in the Olympic Games. He won a gold in Tokyo and silver in Paris in the men artistic gymnastics floor exercise. But the rest of the delegation as well, really impressive athletes, all of them. And I think that in a year like this, and also with the achievements that they have arrived at, they deserve the Mensch Award.
A very good choice, and I think mercifully free, maybe the odd thing of any of the scenes that can sometimes accompany Israelis when they are in international competition or international gatherings. So a shout out to the competitors there in Paris. You and I have not been paying enough attention to the Olympic Games. I can't imagine why. We've had too much else on our plate, I think, but we will say our thank yous.
We will say our big thank yous to Omer Primat and Michal Porat, and we will remind our listeners that very soon we're going to have a questions and answers episode. We have not forgotten about that, even with everything that's been going on. That's going to happen soon, and please, follow us on our Instagram account and Facebook, all in the show notes. And we shall meet next week, Jonathan.
We will, and do keep those questions coming because we will get to them. I know we were planning to do it sooner rather than later, but events have continued to proliferate in our part of the world. So, but we will get to listeners' questions. We want to do that in August. Just keep them coming at Unholy Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. You can offer your questions there. And as Yonit said, details in the show notes. So maybe that's what we're doing next time we see each other. News permitting, we will see. See you next time, Yonit.
See you.